What's up YouTube? It's the one and only Legend of Winning, aka Low, and I'm back with another video. Now this is a video that I've been wanting to make over the past several months now, and due to certain responses from my last video, make sure you go check it out. Not only has it prompted me to make this video, but it has also made it a little bit more clear that what I'm about to state in this video should be undeniably true, and that is the 2000s Western Conference is the greatest conference in NBA history. A conference that was loaded with not only individual talent, but also talent from a team's perspective. A conference that had great coaching, a conference that had players who transcended the NBA, and a conference that had a level of consistency that I do not believe many people thoroughly understand how impressive it was. Now, before we get into the hardcore facts and numbers that are irrefutable, let's talk about some more subjective arguments when it comes to how great the conference was, and that has to do with talent. And I'm pretty sure a lot of you all would agree with what I'm about to say, but when it comes to talent in the Western Conference during the entire stretch of the 2000s, it is easily one of the most talented conferences in NBA history. For starters, we're talking about three players that many of you all would believe are top 10 players of all time played during their primes during this stretch of years, with Shaquille O'Neal, Tim Duncan, and Kobe Bryant. Mind you that both Tim Duncan and Kobe not only played a handful of seasons during this stretch of years, but they played the entire decade. And then after that, you have even more great talent. At the power forward position, not only did you have Tim Duncan, but you also had Kevin Garnett and Dirk Nowitzki, arguably three of the top 5 power forwards of all time. Also, you had players such as Chris Webber and Pau Gasol in that conversation as well. And depending on how you view Shawn Marion, he too was a really good to borderline all-time great player at the power forward position. Then after that, you had the center position. Not only you had Shaquille O'Neal, but you also had a few years of Yao Ming and also Elton Brand. Now moving on to the point guard position, many people would argue you have 2 of the top 10 greatest point guards of all time playing during this stretch of years, with both Chris Paul and Steve Nash. You also have to take into consideration a great player such as Tony Parker, as well as a couple of other point guards that many people may have forgotten, such as Deron Williams and Mike Bibby, 2 players who more likely will not make the Hall of Fame. However, when they were in their primes, it was definitely comparable to some of the other great point guards that I've already listed. Then the shooting guard position, not only did you have Kobe Bryant, but you had both Ray Allen, Tracy McGrady, also Manu Ginobili as well, all Hall of Famers. And then finally, at the small forward position, you have Carmelo Anthony. And even though the small forward position wasn't that deep, there's still a slew of other players that I didn't even name just off the top of my head. Players such as Carlos Boozer, Amari Stoudemire, Andre Kirilenko, Peja Stojakovic, and the other numerous of players that, quite frankly, I just don't have enough time to list off. But if we're only looking at players who are or one day will be in the Hall of Fame, there are at least 14 Hall of Famers who played during their primes during this stretch of years, and again, all of which are already in the Hall of Fame or will undeniably be in the Hall of Fame one day in the near future. So off rip, when we're talking about talent, it is arguably the most talented conference in NBA history. Now, when it comes to the rest of the conversation, that's not even really opinionated because it's just hardcore facts. So first, let's get something clear here. When it comes to the amount of consistency that was in this conference, it's unparalleled to any other conference in NBA history. For starters, when we look at teams that were consistently dominant or at least winning somewhere around 50 games on a year-to-year basis, we basically have 3 teams, with the San Antonio Spurs, Dallas Mavericks, and the Los Angeles Lakers. Now granted, during the mid-2000s, there were 3 years where the Lakers just were not that relevant. But outside those 3 years, for the rest of the decade, the Los Angeles Lakers were a consistent 50-win team. Now keep that in mind. That is basically 3 teams throughout the entire decade that on a year-to-year basis were always going to win 50 games and that were consistently finals contenders. Now with that in mind, also keep into consideration the amount of other great teams that may not have had that level of consistency but were still really great teams for an extended period of time, such as the early 2000s with the Sacramento Kings and the Minnesota Timberwolves, or the mid to late 2000 teams such as the Denver Nuggets, Utah Jazz, and the Phoenix Suns. And because of this level of consistency, the standard of what many people would call a great team had to be higher than the norm, So what was the norm for the 2000s Western Conference? Well, on average, there were 6 50-win teams. The 8th seeded team normally won around 45 to 46 wins, and 10 of the 15 teams in the Western Conference had a record of 500 or better. Now let's thoroughly understand how impressive this is. First, let's acknowledge that 50 wins, which is normally regarded as a really good playoff team in the 2000s Western Conference, not only was it a 6-seeded team, but excluding the 2006 season, a 50-win team would have never received home court advantage throughout the entire decade. Also keep in mind, for people out there who don't know, that in 2008 and in 2010, there were 8 50-win teams, which basically means that 50 wins was a requirement for you just to make the playoffs. Another thing to recognize is that when it comes to 8th seeded teams, those are teams that won roughly around 45 to 46 games, like I stated before, which means a team that many of you all will regard as maybe a team that's just 1 or 2 pieces away from being a 50-win team, or a team that possibly suffered a few injuries throughout the season and maybe a little bit better than their record may show. Those teams were the teams that were barely making the playoffs. Also keep in mind that the worst 8th seeded team during this stretch of years was a 42-win Golden State Warriors team that many of us are aware of, that upsetted the Dallas Mavericks in the first round. And the best 8th seeded team, like I stated before, were the 2 years in 2008 and 2010 where 50 wins was a requirement. Now with that being said, this means that there was never a team with a losing record who made the playoffs during this stretch of years. And oh yes, let's not forget the 10 teams with a 500 record or better. Now one thing I do want to make clear is that in this video, I'm not just talking about the top 3 or 4 teams in a conference, or even just the playoff teams. I'm talking about the entire conference. On average, we're only talking about 5 teams who have losing records in the entire conference. And so with all of that in mind, I really don't understand how anybody can make any argument against the 2000s Western Conference being the greatest conference in NBA history. And if you are going to make an argument against it, please keep in mind that throughout this entire video, I never made any petty arguments, such as me counting Karl Malone, John Stockton, or Kevin Durant, for example, when it comes to some of the all-time great players who played through the 2000s. Because as we all know, all of those players were before or after their primes when they were playing through the stretch of years. So it really wouldn't even make any sense for me to bring up any of those players' names. And with all that being said, I do want to leave you on this note. This is a huge reason why, at least in my view, when a player from the Eastern Conference, regardless if it's LeBron or AI, Jason Kidd, or whoever it is, I really don't hold their accomplishment of making it to the finals in such high regard, especially when you're dealing with the Western Conference within the same stretch of years in which 50 wins more than likely were going to give you an unfavorable matchup in the first round. And the reason why we need to thoroughly understand why that plays such a huge role in explaining how great certain players and teams are is because there are multiple times where teams were getting knocked out in the second round and they were actually one of the top 2 to 3 teams in the entire NBA. But unfortunately, their success in the postseason may not convey that because many people just don't understand the context that needs to be implied in their career. That's why Chris Webber is vastly underrated, along with the early 2000s Sacramento Kings. And so I just ask many of you all to utilize the context, because this is something that many people love to do on the internet. So make sure you are consistent with your level of criticism and context that you try to imply on certain players' careers. And with all that being said, people, please let me know what you think about the video in the comment section below. And also, please let me know if you honestly believe that there is a conference that could even come close to competing to the 2000s Western Conference. Because I honestly do not believe that there is one. Peace.